The stagecoach barely stopped before she tumbled out onto the dusty street, her eyes glazed with fever, and her dress soaked through with sweat despite the autumn chill settling over Ruby City, Idaho. Preston Xander had ridden down from his mountain homestead that October afternoon in 1876 for supplies, nothing more, and certainly hadn't planned on catching a sick woman as she collapsed against his horse. The animal whinnied and stepped back, but Preston's arms were already there, steadying the stranger whose skin burned hot enough to make him wince. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They said there was a doctor here." "Was," Preston said grimly, looking around the small mining town that had seen better days. "Doc Henderson died 2 months back from pneumonia. Nearest physician is 3 days' ride to Boise City, and you wouldn't make it an hour in your condition." Her eyes, a startling green even through the haze of illness, fixed on his face with something like desperation. "I have nowhere else to go." Preston felt something shift in his chest, though he couldn't name it then. He was a solitary man, had been for his 32 years, preferring the company of his cattle and the whisper of pine trees to the noise of people. But looking at this woman, barely conscious and trembling in his arms, he found himself making a decision that would change everything. "My place is an hour's ride up the mountain," he said. "I've got herbs and remedies my mother taught me. It's not much, but it's something." She tried to nod, but her knees buckled. Preston caught her fully this time, lifting her slight frame without effort. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Carver, was already tossing down a worn carpetbag. "That's all she had," Carver said. "Paid her fare from Salt Lake City, said she was coming to work at the new hotel, but hell if that place isn't still just a foundation and broken promises." Preston secured the woman on his horse, climbing up behind her and holding her steady against his chest. Her head lolled back against his shoulder, and he could feel the rapid flutter of her pulse. Whatever sickness had hold of her, it was bad. The ride up the mountain took longer than usual. Preston kept his horse to a careful walk, one arm wrapped around the woman's waist to keep her from sliding sideways. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring words he couldn't make out. Once she said a name. "William." Then, softer, "Gone." The October sun was sliding behind the peaks when his cabin came into view. It wasn't much to look at. A sturdy log structure his father had built 30 years prior, before dying in a mining accident when Preston was just a boy. His mother had raised him here alone until her own death 5 years ago, teaching him to raid, to tend cattle, to recognize which plants healed and which ones killed. Preston dismounted and carefully lifted the woman down. She was limp now, completely unconscious, her breathing shallow and labored. He kicked open the cabin door and carried her inside, laying her on his own bed in the small room off the main living area. The last light of day filtered through the window, casting everything in gold. He worked quickly, building up the fire first until the cabin warmed, then filling a basin with water from his pump. The woman's clothes were travel-stained and damp with sweat. Preston hesitated, propriety warring with practicality, before deciding her life mattered more than convention. He carefully removed her outer dress, leaving her in her undergarments, and covered her with quilts his mother had stitched. Her fever was dangerously high. Preston fetched willow bark from his stores, crushing it and steeping it in hot water. The challenge was getting her to drink. He lifted her head, speaking softly. "Come on now, you need to swallow this. It'll help with the fever." She didn't respond, her head heavy against his arm. Preston persisted, trickling small amounts of the bitter tea between her lips, pleased when her throat worked to swallow reflexively. It was a start. That first night was long. Preston dozed in a chair beside the bed, waking every hour to check on his patient, to wipe her face and neck with cool cloths, to coax more medicine down her throat. She thrashed sometimes, fighting invisible demons, and he had to hold her still to keep her from hurting herself. In her delirium, she spoke fragments of stories he couldn't piece together. Something about fire, about loss, about promises broken. Dawn broke gray and cold. Preston checked the woman's fever and found it unchanged. Her cheeks were flushed crimson, her breathing harsh. He added yarrow to her treatment, remembering his mother using it for infections. The woman's carpetbag sat in the corner, and Preston finally opened it, looking for any clue about who she was. Inside, he found 2 plain dresses, undergarments, a brush with several teeth missing, a small Bible, and a letter. The letter was addressed to Miss Willa Bennett, care of the Grand Mountain Hotel, Ruby City, Idaho Territory. Preston unfolded it carefully. "Miss Bennett," it read, "we are pleased to offer you the position of head housekeeper at our establishment, room and board included. Please arrive by October 1st. Signed, Richard Chambers, proprietor." Preston looked at the woman, Willa Bennett, burning up with fever in his bed. October 1st had been 3 days ago. He'd heard talk in town about the hotel project collapsing after the investor pulled out. This woman had traveled hundreds of miles for a job that no longer existed, only to arrive sick and stranded. The second day was worse. Willa's fever spiked, and Preston fought it with everything he knew. He made poultices of comfrey and placed them on her chest to ease her breathing. He brewed elderflower tea for her immune system. He bathed her with cool water when she burned too hot, and piled blankets when she shook with chills. His own exhaustion became a distant thing. Preston existed only to keep this woman alive, though he couldn't have explained why it mattered so much. He'd seen death before, had lost his parents, had shot wounded animals rather than let them suffer. Life in the mountains was hard, and people accepted that things died. But something in him refused to accept that possibility for Willa Bennett. On the 3rd day, he managed to get her to eat a few spoonfuls of broth. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused and confused. "Where?" she managed. "Safe," Preston said simply. "Rest now." She did, slipping back under, but he counted it as progress. Preston's life had always followed a simple rhythm. Tend the cattle, hunt for meat, chop wood, prepare for winter. But now his entire existence centered on the woman in his bed. He found himself talking to her even when she couldn't hear, telling her about the mountain, about the coming snow, about anything he thought might anchor her to life. "You picked a hell of a time to come to Idaho," he said, while changing the cloth on her forehead. "Another few weeks and the passes will close, won't open again until spring. Course, you didn't know that, did you? Came all this way for a job that didn't exist." He studied her face in the firelight. Even sick, she was striking. Auburn hair spread across his pillow, a stubborn chin, those remarkable green eyes hidden now behind closed lids. She looked younger than him, maybe 25 or 26. Young to be traveling alone, but then these were changing times. The war had ended 11 years ago, leaving plenty of women to fend for themselves. The 4th night brought a crisis. Willa's breathing grew labored, a horrible rattling sound that Preston recognized as pneumonia. He'd lost neighbors to it, had watched his mother fight it off twice before that final winter took her. He worked through the night, keeping Willa propped up so her lungs could drain, steaming the cabin with eucalyptus and pine, praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. "Don't you quit," he told her fiercely, gripping her hand. "Don't you dare quit on me, Willa Bennett." Maybe she heard him, maybe it was the medicine, or maybe she was just too stubborn to die. When dawn came, her breathing had eased slightly. The crisis passed. Preston stepped outside as the sun rose, breathing in the cold mountain air, his hands shaking with relief and exhaustion. His small herd of cattle grazed in the meadow beyond the cabin, the aspens blazing gold against the evergreens. This was his world, simple and isolated. And now a dying woman had crashed into it, disrupting everything. He should have rescented it. Instead, he found himself wanting desperately for her to wake up to see this place, to understand why he'd chosen this solitary life. The days began to blur together. Preston fell into a routine of care, measuring time by doses of medicine and changes of bedding. He brought his work inside, repairing tack and sharpening tools at the table where he could watch Willa sleep. Sometimes he read aloud from his small collection of books, thinking the sound of his voice might help. On the 7th day, her fever finally broke. Preston had been dozing in his chair when he heard her stir. He jerked awake to find her eyes open, truly seeing him for the first time. "You're the man from town," Willa said, her voice rough from disuse. "You caught me." "I did," Preston said, hardly daring to hope. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a horse." She tried to sit up, then thought better of it. "Where am I?" "My cabin, up in the mountains above Ruby City. You've been sick for a week now. Fever and pneumonia." Willa closed her eyes briefly, and Preston saw her processing this. When she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "The hotel," she said. "Someone told me before I passed out." "It's not going to be built, is it?" "No," Preston said gently. "I'm sorry." "I sold everything I had for the train ticket," Willa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My brother died 6 months ago, cholera. The house went to pay his debts. I had nothing left, and then this letter came, and I thought—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "I thought it was God giving me a sign, a fresh start." Preston felt the weight of her loss settle in the room. "I'm sorry," he said again, knowing how inadequate the words were. Willa turned her face away. "You should have left me in town. Would have saved you a lot of trouble." "I don't abandon people who need help," Preston said simply. "My mother would rise from her grave and haunt me if I did." That surprised a small, watery laugh from her. "She sounds formidable." She was. Preston stood, suddenly uncomfortable with the emotion in the room. "I'll make you some proper food. You need to eat." He busied himself at the stove, aware of Willa watching him. The cabin was small enough that she could see everything from the bed, the simple furnishings, the few personal touches. His mother's quilts, his father's rifle over the door, books stacked on a shelf. "Why do you live up here alone?" Willa asked. Preston stirred the porridge he was making. "Suits me. I've got my cattle, plenty of game, good water, don't need much else." "Don't you get lonely?" He'd asked himself that question many times over the years. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I grew up here. My mother raised me after my father died. I know every tree, every stream, it's home." Willa was quiet for a long moment. "It's beautiful country." "It is," Preston agreed, bringing her a bowl of porridge. "Can you sit up?" she managed with his help, though the effort clearly exhausted her. Preston stayed close, ready to catch the bowl if she dropped it. She ate slowly, small bites, but she kept it down. Progress. "What day is it?" Willa asked when she'd eaten half the bowl. "October 8th. You arrived on the 1st. A week," she murmured. "I've lost a week of my life." "You nearly lost all of it," Preston said bluntly. "You were close to dying, Willa. Real close." She met his eyes, and he saw her recognize the truth in his words. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not letting me." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of a debt that went beyond words. Preston took the bowl from her trembling hands and helped her lie back down. "Rest now," he said. "We'll figure out the rest when you're stronger." But even as he said it, Preston knew there was little to figure out. Winter was coming fast. The mountain passes would close soon, trapping them together until spring. And Willa had no money, no job. Nowhere to go even if she could travel. The next few days brought steady improvement. Willa could sit up for longer periods, could eat solid food, could make it to the chair by the fire with Preston's help. She was still weak, her legs shaky, but the worst was clearly past. Preston found himself hyper-aware of her presence in ways that unsettled him. He'd lived alone for 5 years, and before that had only his aging mother for company. Having a young woman in his space changed everything. He was conscious of his manners, of keeping the cabin cleaner, of the way she watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. "Tell me about your brother," Preston said one evening as they sat by the fire. Willa was wrapped in quilts in the chair, and he was working on a broken bridle. Willa's hands stilled on the mending she'd insisted on doing. "William was 3 years older than me, reckless and kind in equal measure. Our parents died when I was 16, and he took care of me. Made sure I finished school, taught me to manage money, to stand up for myself." Her voice roughened. "He wanted to invest in a silver mine in Utah, borrowed money from everyone he knew, promised he'd make us all rich. The mine flooded before they found anything worth selling. William worked himself nearly to death trying to pay everyone back. When the cholera came through Salt Lake City last spring, he was already worn down. He didn't have the strength to fight it." "And you were left with his debts," Preston said. "I sold the house, our parents' things, everything. It almost covered what he owed." Willa's smile was sad. "William would have hated that. He wanted to take care of me, and instead I had to clean up his mess, but I loved him anyway. He was all the family I had left." Preston understood that kind of loss, the way it carved a hole that never quite filled. "My father died in a mining accident when I was 7, he said. "Cave-in. They never recovered his body. My mother never remarried, just raised me on her own. Taught me everything she knew. She died 5 winters ago, pneumonia like you had. I couldn't save her." "I'm sorry," Willa said, and Preston heard genuine understanding in her voice. They were both orphans of a sort, both alone in the world. "She taught me the herb lore that saved you," Preston said. "So in a way, she's still taking care of people." Willa smiled, and Preston felt something warm unfold in his chest. She had a good smile when it was real like that. The second week brought new challenges. Willa was recovering, but winter was closing in fast. Snow dusted the peaks above them, and Preston knew he had maybe 2 weeks before the passes became impassable. He rode down to Ruby City to gather supplies and to ask about work for Willa, though he already knew what he'd find. Ruby City was dying. The silver had played out, the investors had moved on, and the people who remained were hardscrabble miners and their families, too stubborn or too poor to leave. There were no jobs for a woman alone, especially with winter coming. "She could try the boarding house," the general store owner said doubtfully. "But Mabel's barely keeping afloat as it is. Can't pay wages." Preston bought twice his usual supplies, ignoring the curious looks. Word had gotten around that he'd taken in a sick woman. In a town as small as Ruby City, everyone knew everyone's business. "Decent thing you did," Carver, the stagecoach driver, told him. "Taking care of her like that, not many men would." "Couldn't leave her to die," Preston said simply. "Couldn't," Carver agreed. "But wouldn't is different from couldn't. You're a good man, Xander." Preston rode back up the mountain with his supplies and a heavy heart. He had to tell Willa the truth, that she had no options in Ruby City, that she was dependent on his charity. It sat wrong with him, knowing she had no choice, no freedom. But what else could he do? Turn her out to starve? Willa was up when he returned, sitting at the table and peeling potatoes. She'd pinned her hair back and was wearing one of her plain dresses. The domesticity of it struck Preston hard. For a moment, he could almost imagine this was his life, coming home to a woman who waited for him, who made the cabin feel less empty. "Any luck?" Willa asked, reading his expression. Preston set down the supplies. "No, I'm sorry." She nodded, her hand steady on the knife though her knuckles were white. "I expected as much. What about Boise City? I could go there, find work in a restaurant or a hotel." "You could," Preston said slowly, "but winter's coming. In 2 weeks, maybe less, the passes will close. You wouldn't be able to leave until April or May, and you're still not strong enough for that kind of travel. You'd risk getting sick again." Willa set down the knife carefully. "So I'm trapped here." "We're trapped here," Preston corrected. "I winter on the mountain every year." "But yes, once the snow falls, we won't be going anywhere until spring." "I can't stay here," Willa said, panic creeping into her voice. "It's not proper. I can't impose on you for 6 months. I can't." "Willa." Preston's voice was firm enough to cut through her spiral. "You don't have a choice." "Neither of us do. I'm not going to throw you out to freeze or starve. You'll stay here, help me with the work as you're able, and in the spring we'll figure out what comes next. That's how it has to be." She stared at him, her green eyes wide. "People will talk. People talk anyway. Let them." Preston softened his tone. "I know it's not ideal, but it's safe and you'll be warm and fed. That's what matters." Willa looked around the cabin as if seeing it differently now, as her home for the next 6 months. "I don't even know you," she said quietly. "We'll have plenty of time to fix that," Preston said, attempting lightness he didn't feel. The reality of the situation was settling on him too. 6 months alone with Willa Bennett. 6 months of living in close quarters with a woman who made him feel things he'd forgotten he could feel. The 3rd week of Willa's recovery brought a shift in their relationship. The immediate crisis of her illness had passed, leaving them to navigate the strange territory of coexistence. Willa insisted on pulling her weight, despite Preston's protests that she should rest more. "I'm not an invalid," she said stubbornly, sweeping the cabin floor. "And I won't be a burden." "You're not a burden," Preston said, watching her work. She was still too thin, still got tired too easily, but he had to admire her determination. "I'm a woman you didn't ask for, eating your food and taking your bed," Willa countered. "That's the definition of a burden." "I'm sleeping fine by the fire," Preston said, "and I've got plenty of food. Stop being stubborn and accept help." "You're one to talk about stubborn," Willa shot back, but there was humor in her voice now. They fell into a rhythm. Preston handled the heavy work, tending the cattle, chopping wood, hunting. Willa cooked, cleaned, mended clothes, and organized his chaotic shelves. She had a talent for making the cabin feel more like a home, adding small touches that Preston wouldn't have thought of but found he appreciated. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked. Preston learned that Willa had worked as a seamstress before her brother died, that she loved reading but owned no books of her own, that she'd always wanted to see the ocean but had never been farther west than Salt Lake City until now. "What made you stay on the mountain?" Willa asked one night. "You could sell this place, move to a city, have a different life." Preston was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I tried that once. Went to San Francisco when I was 25. Thought maybe my mother was wrong, maybe I needed more than this solitary life." He shook his head. "Lasted 8 months. Hated every minute of it. Too many people, too much noise, everything artificial and cramped. I came back and never left again." "Do you ever regret it?" Willa asked softly. "Not having a family, a wife?" "Sometimes," Preston admitted, "but I'm set in my ways." What woman would want this life? Trapped on a mountain all winter, nothing but cattle and trees for company. It's lonely and hard, and there's no society, no neighbors to gossip with or visit. Willa was quiet, and when Preston looked at her, she was staring into the fire with an expression he couldn't read. "Some women might like the peace of it," she said finally. "The simplicity. Not everyone wants society and gossip." Preston felt his heart beat faster, but didn't let himself read too much into her words. Willa was grateful, that was all. She'd feel differently come spring when she had other options. As the third week drew to a close, the first real snow came. Preston woke to find the world transformed, everything white and muffled. He looked over to see Willa standing at the window, her face pressed close to the glass. "It's beautiful," she breathed. Preston joined her, seeing his familiar world through her eyes. The meadow was a blanket of white, the trees heavy with snow, the peaks beyond brilliant in the morning sun. It was beautiful, he supposed, though he'd seen it hundreds of times. "We're snowed in now," he said. "Won't be able to get to town until spring." He expected fear or dismay, but Willa just nodded. "Then I suppose we'd better get used to each other's company." She turned to him, and Preston was struck by how close she was, how the morning light caught in her auburn hair. For a moment, he let himself imagine reaching out, touching her face, closing the distance between them. But he stepped back instead, clearing his throat. "I'll make breakfast," he said gruffly. If Willa noticed his sudden retreat, she didn't comment on it. But Preston caught her watching him as he worked, and wondered if she felt it too, this pull between them that was growing harder to ignore. The isolation of winter forced an intimacy that Preston had never experienced. There was nowhere to escape, no way to avoid each other. They learned each other's habits, quirks, moods. Preston discovered that Willa sang softly while she cooked, that she was afraid of thunder but not lightning, that she had a sharp wit that often caught him off guard and made him laugh. Willa learned that Preston talked to his horse like it was human, that he read the same books over and over, because they were the only ones he had, that he was patient and kind, and far gentler than his rough exterior suggested. They argued sometimes, small disagreements over foolish things, but they always found their way back to peace. The cabin was too small for prolonged anger. One evening in November, Willa was trying to reach a high shelf when she lost her balance. Preston caught her without thinking, his hands on her waist, steadying her. For a moment they stood frozen, Willa's hands on his shoulders, their faces inches apart. Preston could see flecks of gold in her green eyes, could feel the warmth of her breath. "Thank you," Willa whispered. "Always catching you," Preston said, his voice rough. "Always needing to be caught," Willa replied, but she didn't step back. It was Preston who moved away, shaken by how much he'd wanted to kiss her. He wouldn't take advantage of her dependence on him. When spring came and she could leave, he wanted her choice to stay to be freely made, not coerced by obligation or proximity. But it was getting harder to maintain that distance, especially as the weeks passed, and Willa showed no signs of wanting to leave. She seemed content on the mountain, happy even. She'd never looked more beautiful than she did here, her cheeks pink from the cold when she stepped outside, her eyes bright with laughter at something silly he'd said. December brought deep cold and deeper snow. They were utterly cut off now, just the two of them in their little cabin while the world outside froze. Preston taught Willa to recognize animal tracks in the snow, to read the weather in the sky, to handle his rifle in case she ever needed to defend herself. "You're a good teacher," Willa said one afternoon after she'd hit the target he'd set up. "You're a good student," Preston replied, quick to learn. They stood side by side in the snow, and Willa turned to him with a smile that made his chest ache. "I'm happy here," she said simply. "I thought I should tell you that. I know this wasn't what either of us planned, but I'm happy, Preston." "I'm happy too," he admitted, the words feeling dangerous and necessary all at once. Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly with a small pine tree Preston cut, and Willa decorated with strings of berries. Willa made a feast from their supplies, and Preston gave her his mother's wooden hair combs, fine pieces carved with birds and flowers. I can't accept these, Willa protested, but her hands cradled them reverently. My mother would want someone to use them, Preston said. She'd like you, I think. You're strong like she was. Willa's eyes filled with tears. I don't have anything to give you. You've given me plenty, Preston said honestly. You made this place feel like a home again instead of just a house. That night, sitting by the fire, Willa reached over and took Preston's hand. He didn't pull away, just held on, feeling the rightness of it, the way her smaller hand fit in his. When spring comes, Willa said quietly, and the pass is open and I could leave. She paused, seeming to gather courage. What if I didn't want to go? Preston's heart hammered against his ribs. Why wouldn't you want to go? You could go to Boise City, find real work, have a real life. This is a real life, Willa said, turning to face him. This matters more than anything I had before. You matter. Willa, Preston said, her name a warning and a prayer. I love you, she said simply, courageously. I think I've been falling in love with you since I woke up and saw you sitting by my bedside. I tried to fight it, tried to tell myself it was just gratitude or convenience, but it's not. I love you, Preston Xander, and I want to stay here if you'll have me. Preston felt like he couldn't breathe. You've been trapped here all winter. You might feel differently when you have other choices. I won't, Willa said firmly. But if you don't feel the same way, if you want me to leave in the spring, I'll understand. I'll go. But I needed to tell you the truth. Preston stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Everything in him wanted to pull her into his arms and never let go, but doubt gnawed at him. Was she truly choosing him? Or was she choosing safety, the devil she knew over the uncertainty of the world beyond the mountain? How can you be sure? He asked roughly. You've only known me a few months and we've been trapped together. That's not the same as choosing this life freely. Isn't it? Willa stood too, meeting him in the center of the room. Preston, I've had time to think about what I want. Before William died, I was surviving day to day, making enough money to eat to keep a roof over our heads. I never thought about what I wanted, what would make me happy. And now I know. I want a simple life with a good man. I want to wake up and see mountains out my window. I want to grow old somewhere quiet and beautiful. I want you. Preston's resistance crumbled. He reached for her, pulling her close, resting his forehead against hers. I've been in love with you for weeks, he confessed. Terrified of it, trying to ignore it, but God help me, Willa, I love you too. I love your stubborn pride and your quick laugh and the way you've made this cabin feel whole again. Willa's hands came up to frame his face. Then why are we fighting this? Because I wanted you to have a choice, Preston said. I didn't want you to feel obligated. This is my choice, Willa said firmly. I choose you. I choose this life. I choose us. Preston kissed her then, finally, a soft press of lips that held all the longing and fear and hope he'd been carrying. Willa melted against him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and Preston felt like he'd found something he hadn't even known he'd been searching for. When they pulled apart, both breathing hard, Preston managed a shaky laugh. We should do this properly. Wait until spring, go to town, get married by a proper preacher. Yes, Willa agreed, smiling up at him. We should be proper and patient. Absolutely, Preston said, but he was kissing her again even as he said it, and Willa was laughing against his lips. They tried to be patient, but it was a losing battle. They were in love and isolated, and the cabin had never felt smaller or more perfect. They spent the long winter nights talking about their future, making plans. Preston would teach Willa to handle the cattle, and they'd expand the herd. Willa wanted to plant a garden in the spring, to have chickens, maybe a pig. They talked about children, about how many, about names. At least 2, Willa said firmly one January night as they lay by the fire, properly separated but holding hands. I hated being an only child after William died. Children should have siblings. I was an only child, Preston pointed out. And you grew up lonely, Willa said gently. I want our children to have each other. Our children. The words made Preston's heart race. He'd never imagined a family of his own, and now he couldn't imagine anything else. February brought a thaw that proved temporary, but it allowed Preston to check his cattle and his property lines. Willa came with him, bundled in his spare coat, laughing as she trudged through the snow. They checked the herd together, and Preston taught her the names he'd given each cow, explaining their personalities like they were people. You're a strange man, Preston Xander, Willa said affectionately. Naming your cattle. They're my livelihood, Preston said with dignity. They deserve names. I'm not arguing, Willa said. I think it's sweet. They stood together on a ridge, looking out at the white world below. Preston put his arm around Willa and she leaned into him, solid and real and his. When we get married, Preston said, will you take my name? Become Willa Xander, I will, Willa said. Though I'll miss being a Bennett, it's the last connection I have to William. We could name our first son William, Preston suggested. Keep the name alive. Willa turned to him, her eyes bright with tears. You do that? Of course, Preston said simply. He was your family. That makes him mine too. Willa kissed him then, there on the ridge in the snow, and Preston thought he'd never been happier in his entire life. March brought real warmth, the snow beginning to melt in earnest. Preston knew the passes would open soon, and with them would come the moment of truth. He and Willa made plans to ride down to Ruby City as soon as the trail was passable, to be married properly, and to send word to the territorial government about their union. Are you nervous? Willa asked the night before they planned to make the trip. About marrying you, not even a little, Preston said. About people talking about whether we're doing this right, sure, but about us. Never. Good, Willa said, kissing his cheek, because I'm not nervous either. This is the surest thing I've ever done. They rode down to Ruby City on a bright April morning, the mountains alive with melt water and the first green shoots of spring. The town looked even more depressed than Preston remembered, several buildings now abandoned entirely. But the general store was still operating, and so was the small church. Reverend Matthews agreed to marry them immediately, requiring only 2 witnesses. They found those easily enough in the general store owner and his wife, who seemed delighted to participate in something joyful. The ceremony was simple, no flowers or fancy clothes, just Preston and Willa standing before God and witnesses, pledging their lives to each other. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Preston kissed Willa with all the love in his heart, and she kissed him back with equal fervor. Congratulations, the Reverend said warmly. May you have many happy years together. We will, Willa said confidently, her hand tight in Preston's. They spent one night at the boarding house, their first night as husband and wife, and Preston made love to his wife with tenderness and care, learning her body as he'd learned her heart. Willa was brave and giving, and everything he'd never known he needed. In the morning, they bought additional supplies and headed back up the mountain, to the cabin that was now truly their home. The cattle greeted them with indifferent moos, and Preston laughed at the way Willa scolded them for their lack of enthusiasm. Spring turned to summer. They planted Willa's garden, and she proved to have a talent for growing things. They acquired chickens from a family leaving Ruby City, and Willa named each one, making Preston smile at the reversal. The cattle herd grew with several healthy calves, and Preston taught Willa to manage them. They worked side by side every day, building the life they'd imagined. Sometimes it was hard work, the isolation still real, the winters still brutal, but they faced it together, and that made all the difference. One September evening, nearly a year after Willa had first arrived fever-sick and desperate, she took Preston's hand and placed it on her belly. We're going to have a baby, she said, her eyes shining. In the spring. Preston felt joy explode through him, overwhelming and pure. He pulled Willa into his arms, holding her carefully now, aware of the precious life she carried. A baby, he repeated, awed. Our baby. Are you happy? Willa asked, though she must have known the answer from his face. Happier than I knew was possible, Preston said honestly. You've given me everything, Willa. A family, a home, a future. I love you so much it terrifies me sometimes. Don't be terrified, Willa said, cupping his face in her hands. We'll face whatever comes together. That's what love means. That winter was harder in some ways, with Preston constantly worried about Willa and the baby. But Willa remained healthy and strong, and when the snow fell and they were isolated again, she seemed content, knitting small clothes and talking to her belly about the father the baby would have. Their son was born on a sunny May morning in 1878, arriving with a healthy squall that made Preston laugh with relief. Willa held their baby and cried happy tears, and Preston felt his heart expand impossibly further. William, Willa said, looking up at Preston. His name is William, like we talked about. William Xander, Preston agreed, touching his son's tiny hand, marveling when the baby gripped his finger. Hello, William. Welcome to the mountain. The years flowed past like water, each one bringing new joys and challenges. William grew into a sturdy toddler, then a curious boy, exploring the mountain with the same wonder Willa had shown. 2 years after William came a daughter, Emma, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's quiet temperament. 3 years after that came another son, James, who was loud and fearless and kept them all on their toes. Preston expanded the cabin, adding rooms for the children, a proper kitchen for Willa. The cattle herd grew, providing income enough to support their growing family. They made the trip to Ruby City less frequently now, the town smaller every year as the last miners gave up and moved on. But they had everything they needed on their mountain. Willa thrived as a mother and a rancher's wife. She taught the children to read using Preston's worn books, to recognize herbs and plants, to treat animals with respect and care. She remained Preston's partner in all things, working beside him, raising their children, building a life that felt miraculous every single day. One evening in the summer of 1885, Preston sat on the porch he'd built, watching the sun set over the peaks while Willa sat beside him, her hand in his. William was 14 now, nearly a man, helping his father with the cattle. Emma was 12, beautiful and kind, always with her nose in a book. James was 9, currently attempting to build a fort in the nearby trees with more enthusiasm than skill. You ever miss it? Preston asked Willa. City life, society, all the things you gave up. Willa looked at him in genuine surprise. Never, she said firmly. This is everything I wanted, Preston. Everything and more than I dreamed possible when I stepped off that stagecoach 9 years ago. You were dying, Preston remembered, burning with fever and nowhere to go. And you caught me, Willa said softly. You've been catching me ever since. Preston kissed her, there on the porch with the mountains burning gold in the sunset, and felt the same surge of love and gratitude he'd felt that first winter when she'd told him she loved him. I'd catch you 1,000 times over, he said against her lips. I know, Willa said, smiling. That's why I love you. Their children grew and eventually left the mountain, though not far. William married a girl from the valley and started his own ranch nearby. Emma became a teacher in Boise City, but visited often with her husband and children. James, surprising everyone, became a doctor, dedicating his life to making sure others didn't die for lack of medical care like his mother almost had. Preston and Willa grew old together on their mountain, their hair turning gray, their faces creasing with smile lines. They added grandchildren to the family, then great-grandchildren. The cabin and its surrounding lands filled with life and laughter during summer gatherings. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1907, Preston and Willa stood together on the same ridge where they'd first talked about marriage all those years ago. The mountains were eternal and beautiful, spring bringing new green to the slopes. 30 years, Willa said wonderingly. How did that happen? One day at a time, Preston said, his arm around her waist where it had always belonged. One choice to stay, to love, to build something together. Best choice I ever made, Willa said, leaning her white head against his shoulder. Arriving here with a fever and nowhere to go. Best choice I ever made was catching you, Preston replied, and nursing you for 3 long weeks, falling more in love with you each day. 3 weeks that changed everything, Willa agreed. They stood together as the sun set. 2 people who'd found each other through chance and desperation, who'd built a life of intention and love. The mountain had been Preston's solitary refuge before Willa arrived. Now it was their legacy, filled with children and grandchildren who knew these peaks and valleys, who understood the beauty of a simple life lived with purpose. Ready to go home? Preston asked as the stars began to emerge. Always, Willa said, taking his hand. As long as home is wherever you are. They walked back to the cabin together, their steps slower now but no less certain. 2 souls intertwined by time and choice, and a love that had started with a fever and a stranger's kindness. The mountain stood eternal around them, witness to their story, guardian of their happiness. Inside the cabin, warm lamplight glowed. Their son William had come to visit with his family, and the sound of children's laughter spilled into the evening. Preston held the door for Willa, watching her smile at the chaos of family within, and felt his heart full to bursting. This was what mattered. Not the isolation he'd once preferred, not the solitary life he'd thought he wanted. This love, this family, this home built from nothing but 2 people choosing each other every single day. Willa looked back at him, her green eyes still bright despite the years, still able to make his breath catch. I love you, she said, as she'd said 1,000 times before and would say 1,000 times more. I love you, Preston replied, meaning it with everything he was. They stepped inside together, into the warmth and light and love, into the life they'd built from fever and desperation, and 3 long weeks that had changed everything. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night, holding in the love that had transformed a lonely cabin into a home, a solitary man into a husband and father, a sick woman with nowhere to go into the heart of a family, and a legacy that would outlast the mountains themselves. Years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons. Preston and Willa celebrated 40 years of marriage, then 45. Their children were established in their own lives now. But the mountain remained the gathering place, the heart of the family that had sprung from one moment of compassion on a dusty street in Ruby City. Preston was 78 and Willa 71 when they took their last ride together to the ridge. The autumn of 1916 painted the aspens in brilliant gold, just as it had every year of their marriage. Preston's joints ached, and Willa needed help mounting her horse, but they still made the journey, unwilling to break their tradition. You remember the first time we stood here together? Willa asked, her voice still strong despite her years. When you asked if I'd take your name. I remember everything about you, Preston said honestly. Every moment, every word. My memory might be failing me in other ways, but never about you. Good, Willa said, smiling at him with the same warmth she'd shown for 40 years. Because I remember it all too. Every argument, every laugh, every moment of joy and sorrow. All of it precious. They rode back to the cabin slowly, And that night Preston held Willa close as they'd done for decades, grateful for another day, another moment together. Preston passed peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, in the cabin he'd been born in, surrounded by his children and grandchildren with Willa's hand in his. His last words were her name, a benediction and a promise. Willa lived another 3 years without him, cared for by William and his wife, visiting often by Emma and James. She remained on the mountain because leaving would have felt like abandoning Preston, like breaking faith with the life they'd built. On a spring morning in 1921, Willa sat on the porch Preston had built and felt a familiar presence beside her, though she knew the chair was empty. The mountain was green with new growth, the cattle were lowing in the meadow, and somewhere in the distance she could hear her great-grandchildren playing. "I'm ready," Willa said quietly to the wind, to Preston, to God. "I've lived a good life, the life we built together. I'm ready to come home to you." She closed her eyes in the sunshine, and when William found her an hour later, she was smiling, peaceful, gone to join the man who'd caught her when she'd fallen, who'd nursed her through fever, who'd loved her for more than 40 years. They buried Willa beside Preston on a sunny slope of the mountain, under the aspens that turned gold every autumn. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren gathered to remember, to celebrate, to honor a love story that had started with desperation and grown into something eternal. William stood at his parents' graves and told the younger generations the story. How Willa had arrived sick and desperate in Ruby City. How Preston had taken her in despite having no obligation. How 3 weeks of nursing had turned into a lifetime of love. "They taught us what matters," William said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not wealth or status or society's approval. Just love, commitment, and the courage to choose each other every day. That's their legacy, and it's what we carry forward." The mountain stood witness, as it always had, eternal and unchanging, holding the memory of 2 souls who'd found each other through chance and fate, and the simple human kindness of a man who wouldn't let a stranger die alone. The cabin remained, passed down through generations, always occupied by family, always filled with the love that Preston and Willa had seeded there so many years before. And if sometimes visitors claimed they felt a presence there, 2 spirits standing together at the window looking out at the mountains, no one was surprised. Some loves are too strong to end with death, too powerful to be contained by time. They linger in the places they were born, in the stones and timber and earth, eternal reminders that the best things in life often come from the most unexpected moments. A fever, a stranger's kindness, 3 long weeks of nursing, and 43 years of marriage. A simple story, perhaps, but one that echoed through generations, teaching the value of compassion, the power of commitment, and the transforming magic of love freely chosen and faithfully kept. The mountain remembered it all, holding the story close, whispering it in the wind through the pines, reflecting it in the streams that ran clear and cold from the high peaks. And the family that descended from Preston and Willa continued to thrive, generation after generation, all of them knowing the story of how their legacy began. With a woman who arrived with a fever and nowhere to go, and a mountain cowboy who nursed her for 3 long weeks and loved her for the rest of his life.